Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this live edition of the Beyond the Technology podcast. It's nice to see you all here. You've chosen well. We've looking at the theme today of digital transformation, particularly digital transformation in the setting of creative arts organizations, creative arts universities. And to help us to do that, I've got two lovely guests here, and I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves. So, Jim.
Yeah, my name's Jim Nottingham. I'm currently the Director of Estates, Libraries and Information Digital Services at the University for the Creative Arts, which has 3 campuses across Southeast England and 1 in China.
Thank you, Jim. And Fiona.
Thank you, Chris. Hello, Jim. My name's Fiona Camino. I lead Adobe's work with universities across the UK and Ireland. We partner with institutions to help embed digital creativity and AI-enabled workflows into teaching, learning, and of course, student outcomes.
Excellent, thank you very much. So I'm Chris Thompson. I work for Jisc's advice team as the program lead for digital practice. So, what we're going to be exploring today is really thinking about how different types of institutions do digital transformation differently. Yep. And what we can sort of learn from one set of experience. And we're particularly going to dig into the journey that you've been going on, Jim, your organization, in partnership with Adobe and looking at Adobe products, but not limited to that. Just to kind of see what it is that we can learn from that. But I wonder, just to kind of start us off, just to ask a really broad question, what is it you feel that makes creative universities and creative, and I mean big C creative here rather than, because everyone's creative to some degree. What makes you distinct in how you approach things to do with innovation and change?
Okay, that's an incredibly large subject. I would go back and step a little bit back and talk about creativity as a function, going back 500 years where technology was being used by artists and how that tradition has moved through into more current times with things like Bauhaus and Black Mountain, etc., and where we arrive at art schools as they are now. And I'm happy to admit in front of crowds that I was a fine art student in the early 1980s, and then I stayed in art schools until I got my master's degree, etc., in fine art. So what did that give me personally, and what was the experience of creative art schools? We were talking earlier, and I remember going to a discussion with a writer called Daniel Pink, and this was about 15 to 20 years ago, and he said the new MBA is the MFA. So the role of creativity that is playing in the sector at the moment is incredibly important, and how creative institutions are leveraging their own institutions in order to push that creativity forward. I probably don't need to remind the audience that the second largest sector in the UK is the creative industries. And they're incredibly important to the UK economy, even though, politics aside, we are under, the creative institutions are under a bit of attack. So when we talk about how we would approach innovation, a lot of it is around disturbing the norm, what we would call technology determinism. What are you using the technology for? How are you leveraging it? What is that? What are we giving our students to use? And I remember, stepping back again a little bit, when technology was first coming onto the scene, and one of my roles, very early roles, was to maintain the analog, but also bring the digital. So that marrying of those two particular parts of the technology and how those two worked, how that worked in art schools. And I should also say that the majority of my working experience has been in art schools and arts institutions, from very large to very small institutions. So the approach to innovation is free, it's use the technology, use it to leverage whatever it is you want to make, and then go with that. I mean, it's the DNA that art schools exist in, is challenging the norm, changing the norm, flipping the technology and leveraging the technology in very particular ways that are quite unique to that art school experience. It's changed enormously in the years that I've been teaching, but nowadays it's a bit more functional, it's a bit more structured. But what I get really interested in is where students are on that very bleeding edge of technology and art, and how they're merging those two technologies, and how they're leveraging those technologies in very surprising ways. And I'm still really pleased that I still get fundamentally surprised at degree shows, thinking, how the heck did you do that with that technology and that analog, that kinesthetic skill with the other digital skills that you've learned? So it's a fascinating, intellectually stimulating area to be in. But I'll pass over. Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, Fiona, would you set that in a wider context? Obviously, you work with many institutions, many different flavors. So what do you see about how people are approaching digital transformation these days, and particularly in these kind of creative contexts?
I think one of the most interesting things that we see across higher education is that those institutions making the most progress with digital creativity tend to focus less on the technology itself and more on the environment around it. And I think you touched on that actually, Jim. Creative universities often start with a mindset that experimentation is part of learning. So staff and students feel perhaps more comfortable with exploring some of those boundaries, exploring new ways to express ideas. In some other institutions, there can be perhaps a little bit more caution. They hold themselves back a little bit maybe, particularly around new tools. Or new ways of assessing the student outputs, the student work. But I think what we see and what's most encouraging is that once institutions see how creativity supports key values, things like communication, collaboration, critical thinking, that mindset starts to spread really quickly beyond those key creative disciplines. And it starts to create a bit of a flywheel effect, which is really positive.
Excellent, thank you. I want to start thinking a little bit about vision and strategy when it comes to kind of what is it that you're trying to achieve. And perhaps you could give us an indication of what sort of direction are you heading in at your organisation? What's the vision that you're trying to bring about?
I think we are still at the beginning of the road, and I think that's a really good way to frame it. I don't think we would ever say we're on the road or we're motoring along, because I think there's always that point where you need to stop, question, redo, rethink, reinvent, and I think that's part of that DNA. But we are making moves, especially where we have to teach particular skills, where skills are particularly learning. And I would relate that very much in terms of we teach kinesthetic skills. So we teach someone how to throw a pot, how to blow glass, how to make jewelry. In the same manner, we have to teach those digital skills. So if a student's got a particular thing they want to do with a particular piece of work, how do they make that happen in a digital format? So we need to provide exactly the same skill sets and exactly the same way of learning that are provided in the studio or in that way that will fulfill that creative intent. So I think it's incredibly important that gets embodied in the DNA, but I'm never that satisfied. We were talking earlier, I think it was 30 years ago that I saw my first Radius digital card that would manage 1.4 megasecond, and it cost more than my annual salary. So we've come an enormous way, but there still needs to be that questioning. That question about why, what are we doing it for, what are we hoping to gain from it, and what leverage, what vision are we trying to maneuver towards in terms of the production of the work. That's incredibly important.
So when you started out on this journey, what challenges in particular were you anticipating? I'll come to you with this one as well, because I think you'll have some interesting stories to tell. But what sort of things were you anticipating that you would need to address, and did anything take you by surprise?
I think lots of things take me by surprise constantly. The application of the technology can sometimes run completely counter to what you were originally imagining, what a student will do at a particular piece of technology. Like they may try, we had some students who they would deliberately set out to hack particular systems and particular ways in which things would work, so it would generate unexpected results. And unexpected outcomes. We also have a lot of things which surprised me around things like, some of you are familiar with telematics and haptics and telematics and where that's going in terms of interaction and talking about technology and art, and how that gets produced. But it does mean you do need to cover a spread a very wide spread of the mixture of technology, engineering, creativity, etc., in order to get the students to the point they want to be at.
Great, thank you. So Fiona, yeah, when you're helping people to navigate these waters, when they're building their strategy and their plan, what is it you tell them, particularly when you're looking at things from that sort of Adobe perspective?
Stay calm.
Okay, fine. Good luck.
That's always a good starting point. I think what we constantly see across the sector is that those successful institutions with a clear purpose.
Right.
So when we're planning out strategies and we're having those discussions, if there's a clear purpose that we can all work towards and align with, it becomes more obvious that they're not just adopting technology for the sake of technology. They're connecting it to a wider strategy, a wider objective. And those are typically institutional goals that are aligned to improving digital creativity, capability, strengthening their graduate outcomes. Of course, that's key to employability, and also making sure that they're creating an inclusive learning environment. I think some of the other factors that we tend to come across really is leadership sponsorship, the importance of that leadership sponsorship. So when digital creativity is part of an institutional strategy, adoption becomes much more of a shared goal, rather than something that happens in silos or that one individual perhaps takes on as a hero project. So I think some of those challenges, some of the things that we see are very much shared learnings. But I think, overall, getting staff engaged, that will always drive forward that adoption and just that sense of inclusivity.
So if I can stay with you for a second, so that's kind of the big picture, so we're talking about vision and strategy. Obviously, you've got to make strategy work. You've got to turn it into changes in behavior, changes into differences in skill, and so on. What does that look like? In a successful organization, what happens?
I think the common goal has got to be really getting staff, teaching and learning, comfortable with a new tool set,
right.
Getting them to believe in the value, in the output. And I think once that's achieved, and you have that confidence in teaching and learning and across the staff, that permeates down to students. I think that is absolutely a key indicator, and definitely something worth investing and supporting for institutional success.
Great, thank you. Jim, how does it look at your place?
In terms of strategy, it was a concept that I hadn't tackled before. Normally, you'd be asked to write a digital strategy or an IT strategy, and it's a standalone document. What was introduced to me at UCA, what they wanted me to do was to produce what they called an enabling digital strategy. And a little nod to my colleagues at Jisc and Jisc Consulting, we worked together to form an enabling digital strategy. So the whole idea with that was the enabling digital strategy, along with the enabling estate strategy, would sit around all other strategies. So the estates, the fixed estate was incredibly important, but the digital estate was equally important. But these would be the two enablers. And then as you go further and further in, each enabling strategy would be supporting those other key areas. Conceptually, it wasn't one that I was used to doing, but we worked our way through it, and the approach that was taken with Jisc and Jisc colleagues was actually incredibly helpful, to sort of look at it maybe through a different lens. So we're not just doing this standalone thing, we're actually thinking about the whole institution. And I think strategically as well, incredibly important to be at the table. You've got to be at that top table. It's pointless having these conversations 3 or 4 layers down or trying to telegraph it through another 2 layers. It's incredibly important to be at that table. I can't emphasize that enough. I mean, if somebody said to me, we'll give you a lovely job, Jim, but you won't be on the executive leadership team, I would probably say, no, I don't want to, because I'm not going to make the progress that we need. And we need to be in the room at the time when those conversations take place. So incredibly important.
Yeah. Fiona mentioned this thing about sort of that sort of approach of kind of getting things right at the top and letting things cascade. I always wonder what it's like working with probably quite rebellious, artistic students. I mean, do you find that actually you sort of introduce new sets of tools, new ways of creating, that starts to feed upwards as well? Does that happen?
We found it can be a bit of both. We have quite some of our students are very intolerant of AI, for example. You know, they feel that the copyright issues around AI are issues that we're simply not tackling. And for some instances, they come to me, come to the institution saying, you're not equipping us with the tools that we need to protect our creative outputs. So we are tackling that at the moment. We're having discussions with the students. Students and our students are going to always be contrary to a certain extent. So you have to kind of expect that type of behavior. My role is really to say, here's a digital workshop. Here are all the tools that you could possibly have, and use them safely, use them wisely, but go for it. We're not going to put particular stringent controls on this. We will tell you if that might be illegal, or that's really, really dangerous to do that. But for the most part, we have to allow the students that creative freedom, to explore, to change, to go where they need to go. And I think what we saw earlier today, I'm thinking about the keynote we saw, that's the generation that's now coming through, who are very interested in social cause, exploration. They're interested in very different things than the previous cycle of generation coming through, who are sort of on that wave of cusp of when digital and analog were beginning to come in. Digital is fairly firmly established. It's what we do with it. And then now we're at the point of, okay, we get it, but this is where we're going to go with it. We're looking at social cause, we're looking at social change, we're looking at social justice. We're also looking at really changing the way we think about creativity. So I think it's a fascinating time at the moment. It's really interesting.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. I mean, sorry, I'm going a little bit off script here, Fiona. Do forgive me. Because you do a lot of work with students as well, a lot of outreach directly with them. How are you seeing students changing these days in their approach to the use of digital technology to help them to learn, but help them to express, to develop their skills?
I think we are definitely seeing a mixed response. It's a mixture between concern. There's a bit of skepticism in there, which is always healthy, and rightly so. You should always question. That's the critical thinking piece. Always question and make sure you understand. But generally, excitement actually, because these tools, particularly in the hands of students, offer so much opportunity. And we were discussing this earlier, Jim. We might work with students on a particular brief, but it's incredible to see how far further they go with that, and the work that they produce. And I've done many sessions with students where we might give them a quick masterclass, and you think, well, I hope that's enough. And to literally see them take the application and run with it, and their output is phenomenal. So in summary, it's a very mixed, cautious bag, but I think overall they're excited, they're particularly thrilled when it's available to them through their institution. And again, some of those outputs are extraordinary, and it makes me feel very assured that our future's in good hands when I see what these incredibly smart young people produce.
Yeah, that's encouraging. Thank you. I want to move on to sort of our final sort of batch of questions. I imagine the people sitting out in front of us, not everybody here works for a creative, large C organisation. So I just kind of wonder, what is it that you've taken from this process, or you are taking from this process, that translates well, it travels well? So it would be something that you would encourage other people that are on this journey to be thinking about? What have you learned and what surprised you? Is there a secret sauce?
I don't think there is. I think a lot of other universities, when I was part of the group that were negotiating with Adobe and on behalf of Jisc and UCISA, and what we saw there was very particular conversations we had about creative institutions and their use of the Adobe products. Yes, that's what we do. But what about everybody else? What was happening out there? And we had some of my colleagues who had a very, very large nursing school, for example, and they wanted their nurses to be able to present in really clear, cohesive manners. And using some of the AI products, some of the Adobe products, Express, etc., really did help that. It really changed the way in which the students were thinking about their presentations and presentation quality and the leveraging of those skills. It was seen as a really important, Fiona mentioned it, around employability. That employability gap, the ability to produce something really interesting and really good. So in spite of sort of pushing the sector for my own creative institution's best interest, but also how can we also leverage the other tools that are available within the product and get those tools as far and wide as possible. And I think to Adobe's credit and to Jisc and UCISA's credit, the arrangements that we arrived at were really good for the sector. And I see that as not a one-off. This is going to continue. The relationship will continue. We're discussing the next steps and where this relationship is going. But I think the way in which we leverage all these tools, not just Adobe, Microsoft, all these tools are changing fundamentally. And we're putting tools that are far easier to use in normal students' hands, non-creative students' hands, and that's got to be a good thing. It's not it's got to be seen as a clear positive for the entire sector. So.
Thanks, Jim. Is there a secret sauce, Fiona, when it comes to transforming your organization and sort of bringing a creative twist to that? Or is it much more complex than that?
That's a very deep question. I think it can be simple, but I appreciate that it's not simple.
Yeah.
Of course, we're very aware of the pressures that much of the sector is under and going through. What I would say is that I think perhaps one of the most helpful starting points might be to think about creativity as not in the traditional sense of creativity. It's actually the new, if you like, the new currency for communicating ideas rather than just producing that piece of artistic work. It's much broader. In many disciplines today, we're already seeing students solving complex problems and analysing information. The example you used, Jim, nursing, trying to communicate a very difficult or complex issue. And also helping to develop new ideas, using these tools, using these platforms, a way of collaborating. I think digital creativity simply gives students a new way to express their thinking, and it might be through visual storytelling, it might be through the form of presentations, or indeed, for institutions, coming back to institutions, it might well be multimedia, multimodal assessment that enables that. I don't think there is a single right answer to that.
Excellent, thank you.
It's a hard one.
We've got a few minutes left. I just kind of wonder, because obviously you've been thinking quite a lot about this since we threw these questions at you a couple of weeks ago. And I just wonder if there's could I give you an opportunity to kind of touch base on anything that you think is kind of important that I haven't asked you about?
Oh, goodness.
I mean, maybe kind of let you think about that for a second.
Thank you. I think in terms of a lot of these tools and where we're going with the tools, the technology and the tools, the analog to digital, now we seem to be going digital back to analog again. We're now, I think I can make some money with my old Pentax K1000s now, and because it's become so global, it's less private, and a lot of making, when you go into creatives, it's a private function to a certain extent, and privacy is everything, but then when you explore that. So I think there's something around that. I also think that, one of my favorite sayings is with Gartner, I think we are at the peak of inflated expectations at the moment. We've been at that peak for quite a long time. We are going to do the whole dropping into a trough at some point, but I don't think it's going to be that far. So I think we're getting there, and I think universities are beginning to really understand this technology and the application of the technology, particularly not just in creative institutions, but across the piece. I mean, AI is obviously a huge discusser, and it's a huge segregator as well, but it's becoming more and more, less and less of an issue, more and more of a tool. It's a means to an end. Somebody described to me the other day that in 5 years' time, they believe that AI will be just like, it's just normal. It's the part of the plumbing. It's part of what you do. It's part of what students will leverage in order to get their work done, in order to do things. I mean, but there are lots of issues, and we were talking about them earlier, which our students are bringing to us around AI, around the environment, around sustainability, et cetera, et cetera. And we were talking about the controls that Adobe sort of applying to AI, so to stop people just saying, "Oh, I want 10 minutes. I want a 10-minute movie of this," and that is incredibly important also. So I think it's still a kind of greyish, but it's becoming a lot clearer about the sense of direction, where we're going with all of this, where we're going with learning, where we're going with the way in which students learn, the way in which they analyse their learning, the way in which they analyse these tools and push forwards. I think it's got to be, universities have to acknowledge that these are key skills that students will have to have in order to enter the workplace and for employability. So we have to embrace it to a certain extent, but I don't think we're exactly running towards it. I think it's a gentle sort of, okay, we need to find out what's going on here. Dive deep in some areas, not so far in others. But it's in 5 years' time, it'll be really interesting to see what conversation we have.
All right, okay, you're on.
Yeah,
So we'll do
come
that.
in 5 years.
You're all invited. Thank you very much. Fiona, how about you? I mean, could be to do with AI, but sort of, is there anything else that you kind of think, this would be really kind of important to mention when it comes to the experiences you have?
So I think just a couple of things, really. I think from what I have observed, for institutes that have done really well, who've picked up these tools, have worked with yourselves, who've engaged, who've leaned in, and I don't like that phrase, but they have leaned in. They have created an environment where experimentation is safe, it's okay. And I think, to your point, Jim, when you get a sense of what the tools can do for you, what the limitations are, then you have perhaps a better understanding of what AI can do for you. I think something critical is really, building that staff confidence. I think that is critical to long-term success. Build the staff confidence, because confident educators produce confident students. Like I say to everyone, you're not going to break the tools. Play with them, see how far you can push them. Close it down, walk away from it. It's all safe. It's part of the experimentation. It's part of learning.
Excellent. Thank you. Well, we'll close off very quickly with one piece of advice that you could give maybe your younger selves or somebody out in the audience that is engaging in this sort of process. What would you say to them?
I don't know. My younger self, I'd say buy Apple shares. I don't know.
Too late for that now?
Yeah, too late for that.
Yes.
Or Adobe shares. I think it's to be open-minded, to not be narrow in the opportunities that are in front of you, especially now, in terms of technology and the application of technology, the way in which you learn. Be flexible, be open-minded, be open to experimentation. Constantly challenge the norm, which is that, again, going back to my original being an art student, challenging, do things differently, be an individual. That's, I think, I would say to myself going back.
Thank you, Jim. Fiona, how about you?
Confidence is the digital gateway.
Ooh, okay.
I think I think, you know, definitely students are far more confident than me. Certainly my two children are far more confident than me, and I think that's a good thing. It's a good thing.
That could be the tagline for next year's DigiFest.
My gift to you.
Okay, thank you very much. We'll take that. All right, so thank you very much to Jim and Fiona for giving us your time and your insights on your journeys. Perhaps we could give them a round of applause. Say thank you.
Thank you.